Alright, what's going on, guys? I've been playing Elden Ring DLC for about 4 days straight now. I've reached the final boss and I'm still working on it, but what I can confidently say is that this DLC is the best DLC FromSoftware has ever created, and it's really not close. And considering that pretty much all of FromSoftware's past DLCs were 10 out of 10s, then you can imagine how I feel about this one. Now, I do have some complaints about it, which I'll likely detail in future videos, but overall, I think it very clearly is a 10 out of 10 for what it tries to be. But if you were to go check Steam reviews right now, that's not the picture you would get. And that's because at the moment, Shadow of the Erdtree is currently under fire by a campaign of people trying to review bomb it. And you may be wondering, well, if this DLC is so good and FromSoftware at their best, why would anybody want to review bomb it? Well, we're gonna read through a lot of these and find out. And I can tell you right now, it's pretty ridiculous. So as we get into this today, if you're playing through the Elden Ring DLC and are thoroughly enjoying it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because I'm going to have a ton of Elden Ring DLC content over the next few weeks, and probably for the next year, if we're being honest. But take a look at this. Popping over to the Elden Ring Steam page, you will see that reviews are mixed, which has never happened for a FromSoftware game ever. And if you look at recent reviews, over the past few days there are a flood of negative ones. So let's just go no cherry picking straight down through these negative reviews, and find out why they exist. I finished Dark Souls Trilogy and I'm at the final bosses of Elden Ring. The difficulty level in all of them was balanced. I played this DLC just out of curiosity, and I've never seen such contrived difficulty in boss battles in my life. It's not just lifeless nerds who played this game, there are also busy casual players like me. I can't spend hours on a fake difficulty boss. Making AI read input does not mean a challenge. Use your brain next time when designing a boss. Now you're gonna notice a common theme between a lot of these reviews, and that is the difficulty. And before we even break this down, I will easily concede that this is a very hard DLC. It's probably the hardest FromSoftware content they've ever made. This DLC is also supposed to be the final cap and pinnacle of Elden Ring content. We all knew it was going to be hard. It was advertised as being hard, so I don't know why we're all surprised here that it is. So I think it would be exceedingly unfair to say that because it's hard, it's bad. The question here is it good difficulty or bad difficulty? Now this negative review gives one specific example of what a bad difficulty boss does: input reading. Now, we do know for a fact that certain bosses in the base game of Elden Ring did at one point have input reading, the Godskin duo specifically. If you pressed an input to heal, it would chunk a fireball every time. Now in a later patch this was removed, or at least reduced, I can't remember for certain, but off the top of my head I can't recall any instances of the DLC bosses input reading in that regard, and I know for a fact the final boss does not, at least from my own testing. And I will agree wholeheartedly that input reading is bad design, nobody likes it. But we have to ask here, is the reviewer just making this up as an excuse for the bosses being hard? Let's read some others and see if they feel the same. It's hard for the sake of being hard is a really good way of describing it. There's a difference between hard and bad boss design. Now this next review at least gives some examples of why that is. I've just completed all the main remembrance bosses for Shadow of the Erdtree without summoning, so now I can give an informed opinion on them. Before I begin, let me just say that the content added aside from the bosses is a great addition to the game. The world is amazing, the music is great, the new weapons and abilities are awesome additions, and so on. The reason I gave the negative review is because the bosses are incredibly poorly executed and are simply a series of cheap tricks being spammed repeatedly that take chunks out of your health. They are not fun to fight whatsoever. I personally gained no satisfaction whatsoever from defeating any of them, instead only fleeting relief. These new bosses only serve to highlight the terminal main issue that this game has. The player combat in Elden Ring is not adequate for the enemies you face. It does not offer a compelling, skill-based experience like Sekiro and Bloodborne. You are being frustrated into trying to get damage in after watching the boss do a series of acrobatics for 15 seconds, only to get slammed by a combo extension that is intentionally designed to catch you out when you get sick of waiting around. This is not fun. This is the main point I'm making with this review. It's not that it's too hard for me. The intended way to fight these bosses in the game is not fun. Now, of course, fun is subjective, and I can't really argue against the fact that this person didn't have fun, but what I can argue against is the claim that the player does not have the adequate ability for the bosses at hand. That is just fundamentally untrue. The reason people end up feeling this way is because they don't utilize the tools that the game gives them and forget how many aspects of combat Elden Ring provides. And I'm not talking about summoning. I myself am a pretty average player, and I managed to beat all except the final so far without summoning. What the majority of people forget is that every boss has a weakness. This DLC shoves crafting down your throat. There are so many cookbooks, it wants you to use items. Every single boss has an elemental weakness. weakness. So these items are extremely useful for turning the tide of a boss fight. Does the boss wear little armor and have lots of skin exposed? Maybe you should try bleed. Is the boss made of wood? Try fire. Is the boss wearing metal armor and standing in a giant pool of water? Try lightning. These are things you need to consider. I know most people want to take the same build into every fight and fight every boss the exact same way. It's just not the smart thing to do. And I can see how that would get boring. I'm not saying to change your whole build every fight, but think outside the box. Here's another very long-winded review that I won't read the entirety of, but they do go into detail a little bit about the bosses, saying, I have mixed feelings about the bosses. Normally all bosses would be balanced somewhat. Sure, some will be stronger than others, but there would be a balance between its attack power, health, downtime, and speed. Most of the bosses in this DLC seem to be jacks of all trades. They're tanky, attack really fast, deal a lot of damage, and have minimal downtime. This makes it that the average player is forced to adapt their build. At the end of the game, I finally tapped into multiplayer and realized that almost everyone gave up on rolling to dodge and just used a heavy shield with a needle to poke enemies to death. Even the final boss becomes a joke with this build. Now, I didn't actually read this review before stating that last point about thinking outside the box, but it kind of proves exactly what I was saying. Think outside the box. Now, I'm not a fan of cheese builds, but how many people used a great shield in the base game? Very little. You are meant to experiment. I don't understand why you would want to go into the DLC and not try new things. For example, I played the first half of the DLC with Raptor Claws and Bloodflame Blade, and it worked pretty well, but about at the midpoint I got to a boss I physically couldn't hit because they didn't have enough range. So I went and explored the map and found a great katana that fit with my stats, and ended up beating the boss first try with this new weapon. Now, could I have sat there all day, memorized every single move the boss has, and attacked only at the times my claws could reach? Yeah, that's a viable option, but it would have been really boring. Instead, I got to go experience more content the DLC had to offer and find a new and, in my opinion, much more fun way to play. And my brother, who was playing beside me, got to the same boss, didn't want to change his build, but figured out the boss's elemental weakness and employed that, making it honestly pretty easy. So the point here is, you don't have to change your entire build for each fight, you just have to get creative. Stop trying to fit a square into a triangular hole. And even if you are that stubborn, eventually it will break through. Now, I totally understand the point if you're mad about the bosses constantly roll catching you. It is no secret, these bosses are designed to punish your pre-existing playstyle. They slightly delay their attacks. They have long combos, and some of them do have very short downtime. That's not necessarily bad design, it's just things you have to adapt to. And even if all you do is roll and R1, every fight is still possible that way. And again, even if you don't want to learn all the moves, you can go get almost all of the Erdtree fragments as soon as you enter the DLC, not having to fight any bosses. And if you do that, it'll make at least the first half of the Remembrance bosses very easy in comparison. But if you go and read through these reviews, one thing you'll notice is a lot of the people complaining that the DLC is too hard didn't care to go looking for these fragments. I mean, you have the official Elden Ring website putting out a guide to go look for them, and they still won't do it. So at that point, what can you do? Those people are beyond help. But here's the thing, these bosses are supposed to be that hard. They're supposed to be the toughest challenges in the entire game. This is the pinnacle of Elden Ring. If the bosses were exactly the same way that the base game bosses are, with much more downtime, shorter combos, and slower moves, and there was no new leveling system, then there would be no peak. It would just be more bosses on the same level, and the DLC wouldn't feel like the culmination of everything you've learned in Elden Ring so far. The insane feeling difficulty is entirely necessary, and even thinking back, the absolute hardest bosses in FromSoftware games have always been in the DLCs. This is nothing new. Manus, Fume Knight, Orphan of Cause, Midir, all DLC bosses, and all some of the most memorable fights in the games. They are memorable because they are those ultimate challenges. And even when it comes to this DLC, you only have to fight 3 bosses. The majority of the ones I see people complaining about in these reviews are optional, so I don't know what to tell them. I really would like to see more detail and examples provided of how a lot of these bosses have quote-unquote bad design, because having fought all the bosses so far, only one of them I think has bad design. And that's just because I think there's obvious problems with the hitboxes. But for the sake of spoilers, I'm not going to specify which one. It is a somewhat later one. But here's the thing too that I think a lot of people don't understand and are running into problems in this DLC. Some of these attacks that the bosses have require a certain directional dodge. You can't just dodge into them and expect to not get hit. You have to dodge in a certain direction. And there have been multiple attacks that do that I've noticed. For example, the final boss has an attack that can only be dodged when dodging perfectly perpendicular to the attack. So if it's coming straight on, you have to dodge at a 90-degree angle left or right. That's not bad design, it's just that most people won't take the time to learn that and pick up on how it's possible to dodge. With these bosses being the ultimate challenge in the game, they're inevitably going to have to be more complex. Yes, that means harder, but it's not simply just for the sake of being harder, it's necessary. And honestly, the fact that FromSoftware has achieved this difficulty while still making every approach to the boss mostly viable is really impressive, because I've seen too many games do hard bosses but only have one way to beat them. And I think a lot of people are going to be surprised after they played this DLC and then go back and play the main game again. You're going to notice just how much you improved as a player. And when that realization happens, then you're going to know that it was good design all along. So overall, I don't agree with these bad reviews at all. I think we're dealing with some really incredible boss fights here. Now I know when I've died 30 times and I rage and throw my controller and say the bosses are badly designed, that doesn't make it true. And I think that kind of situation is what's going on with a lot of these here. Now aside from whining about the bosses, I did see quite a bit of negative reviews talking about the performance, and I do have to give that position. I myself had a lot of performance issues in this DLC, even sometimes frame skips in the boss fights that got me hit by an attack I otherwise would have dodged. So that bit is true, but definitely not as common as some people are making it out to be. It was mainly condensed to the early areas. Toward the end of the game, I didn't have any at all. But now you know why some people are so mad about Elden Ring DLC, and let me know down in the comments, do you agree with them? What are your overall thoughts on the DLC so far, and have you beaten it yet? Either way though, if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here. Again, I will have a ton of Elden Ring DLC content coming out soon, but with all that, I will catch you in the next one.